Welcome back to the colloquium on the revolution in intelligence affairs, part 2. We will, I will now introduce Mr. Duyane Norman. He leads the Defense Innovation Unit's engagements with DoD's agencies and the intelligence community. Mr. Norman retired from the CIA, where he served in the Office of Technical Services within the Directorate of Science and Technology. He has served on several overseas tours with the Directorate of Operations, 3 of which as Chief of Station. He also served multiple senior level assignments at the CIA headquarters. He will talk to us today about the very interesting topic of disruption and the business of espionage. Duyane, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for having me and spending some time today. Like Jack and Davey, I'm going to speak for about the first half of my allotted time, and then open it up to questions at the end, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. Hopefully there'll be a free-flowing discussion in the second part. I'm going to focus my comments on the human side of the business of intelligence. And so when you talk about, when Jack earlier spoke about this coming revolution, it's my belief that, at least as far as the business of espionage, that change is already here. And so we don't really have a prolonged period of time to start to address these challenges. They're already being imposed upon us. And to frame this conversation, before I talk about the specific challenges to the business of espionage, I think it's worthwhile to take a couple minutes to talk about the world we live in today. I think everybody in this call is would agree that we live in an unprecedented era of change. The amount of disruption that is happening within the private and public sectors today is unprecedented. Certainly in our lifetimes, but I would argue in world history. And within the private sector, you see companies and entities succeed or fail. Lots of stories within business schools and within the private sector about why Blockbuster fails and Netflix succeeds, or why Kodak fails and how Apple becomes a leader in photography and film technology, right? So the world of clandestine human operations is not immune to that. And so many of the other topics for discussion during this colloquium, whether it's artificial intelligence, machine learning, or open source, as Davey spoke about, have a profound impact on our ability to conduct human operations. And so when you're talking about human operations, you're predominantly talking about the collecting of not just information on our adversaries, but their plans and intentions and the human element within there. Traditionally, that's done through the spotting, assessing, developing, recruiting, and handling of agents of clandestine sources. But there are a number of different aspects that go into it. But for thousands of years, there have been some foundational elements that underpin the business of espionage. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. One of them is the idea that espionage is conducted by people pretending to be something or someone they are not. And we call that cover, right? You live your life under cover. You don't go up and tell somebody that you are that you are a spy and you want to, acquire their secrets. So the idea of operating under cover is foundational. Another one is conducting your operational activity away from prying eyes, right? In secret. And we call that tradecraft. If you think about a John Le Carre novel, right? It's, meeting in a back alley somewhere where people don't know that you and your asset or your target have these interactions and are in touch with each other. And they certainly are unable to determine what you talked about or or collect information on the secrets that are passed between you. Now, I would argue because of, or I think it's self-evident that because of the massive changes in the world today, those two practices have already not only fundamentally been disrupted, but rendered in most cases obsolete. The idea that in a world of ubiquitous surveillance, of digital dust, of data everywhere, that any of us can effectively present ourselves as something other than what we are is, I won't call it laughable, but it presents incredible challenges. Now, please don't take this wrong way. I don't mean that cover is not, that you cannot create effective covers today, but I think that the idea that you can create it for a large cross section of an intelligence community and have a broad array of collections officers out and about pretending to be something or someone they are not, is simply not sustainable. So the amount of effort and energy that needs to go into building and sustaining covers requires, as Jack put it, he talked about the need for reimagining of the business. So it's not simply finding better or more effective ways to do it. It is, how do you reimagine the very foundations of it? And when I was at CIA, we talked often about, if we were standing up the organization today, how would we do it? Would we build it the way that we have built it, that it has been, kind of grown organically over the last several decades, or would you construct it in a different manner? And I think that, that the ultimate answer is yes, but how do you take entities and organizations and practices that have existed for decades or centuries and reinvent them, right? And that is a huge challenge. Specifically related to cover, I'll just give a few examples. The idea, because I think it's worth talking about. Whether you opt into it or not, as Davey talked about, our ability to privacy within this data, massive amounts of data that are collected on us. Whether you opt into it or not, there is an incredible amount of data that is collected on you and your activities, your pattern of activities every day. And there are sensors that are arrayed around you in increasing numbers all the time, right? If you drive a car that is, less than probably 15 or 20 years old, it probably has telematics in it. Almost all of us carry a cell phone with us. Increasingly, we have smartwatches, but there are also a growing number of sensors and collectors on outside of us, outside of our possession, that are collecting on us, whether it's traffic cameras, Wi-Fi networks, hotspots, facial recognition cameras and software. And so these massive data sets, as Davey pointed out, which are publicly available, in many cases are available for purchase, are constantly compiling data on our patterns and activities. The challenge is that, so if you want to, for example, not have it known that you are going to a known IC training facility for training, or that you are not going to a known IC building to enter a skiff so that you can communicate effectively or type up whatever you're working on, you can't, you have to somehow take away all of these different collectors or avoid all of these different points of collection. But the problem with that is, even if you can in this environment be successful at doing that, so you turn off your phone, you drive an old car, you turn off your phones at home, you avoid any type of network, any type of routes that would cause you to pass by any other sensors, then you have another problem. You've effectively, by dropping off of the grid, simply created another signature, another identifiable signature, right? Because if you're not where you should be or where you purport to be on a day-to-day basis for work, and if you have no Wi-Fi signal there, or if you never use an ATM, or if you don't eat lunch, or if you don't answer your social media during the day, or your emails because you've left your personal connectivity outside of the skiff where you work, then all you're doing is highlighting yourself as somebody who is hiding or avoiding it. And the only people who do that are spies and criminals. So so the idea of living undercover requires a total immersion, for lack of a better way to put it, in those types of covers, and it's a different way of thinking about cover. Likewise, tradecraft. Tradecraft, the idea of operating in the shadows and away from prying eyes, requires both parties, both the operators, we call them case officers, right? But the collector and the asset to effectively drop off of the grid and meet and connect in some way where adversaries cannot know that they have met and not know that they have exchanged information. Now, you can do some of this electronically. There are huge challenges with that as well. And the same challenges and threats exist because just like there are sensors and collectors within the real world, there are sensors and collectors and patterns that can be analyzed within the virtual world. But no matter how you do it, eventually that personal connection is critical to effective relationships. And so you can't, I suppose you can meet, spot, assess, develop, and recruit and handle in the virtual world. That's a whole different set of challenges. And we can talk about that in the questions if you want. But for the sake of this discussion, let's talk about the actual physical contact between humans. Even if you can limit that, even if you can minimize that, you're still going to create these patterns. And just like the challenges for the case officer, you can look at the challenges for assets the same way. You can look at the people who are putting their lives on the line in order to help and collaborate with us, and they have to worry about that same absence of a pattern, right? So if they're out on the streets trying to avoid any notice of where they're going or any traceable kind of records of where they're going, what happens when they can't answer their phone, or when their car, they can't take their car, or they take their car someplace they're not supposed to be, right? What kind of patterns are they creating that will cause them to answer questions? And it may be as simple from a curious spouse, or it may be from the service that is looking at them because of their position. So all of these challenges, these fundamental challenges to the way that the business of espionage has been conducted for hundreds of years, require us, I think, to actually come back to, okay, what is the what are the true foundations of the business, and how do we rethink and reimagine the business of espionage to conduct it in a fundamentally different way. I want to open it up to questions pretty quickly here, but what I would like to do is spend a couple of minutes on what I believe, at least part of the answer is. I believe that the answer, like a lot of these things, if you're going to reimagine the business, then you have to look at, I think, all of the different potential options. And I believe that the biggest challenge for us today within the IC, especially related to the human side of intelligence, is a recognition that that business can no longer be conducted exclusively by this collection of, for lack of a better way to put it, clandestine warriors or operators. What I think about the movie A Few Good Men, and if you think about that movie, and Jack Nicholson is testifying on the stand, and the whole premise of his argument is that there is this elite cadre of warriors who man these walls, who defend the rest of our country and our value set from hostile adversaries. So the vast majority of the population can sleep in blissful ignorance at night because there are these defenders on the wall, and they have special rules and special capabilities that they live by. But the fact that they are there is what keeps everybody safe. And I think today's world, the answer to this challenge is not going to be in clandestine warriors who are operating in secrecy. I mean, that will be part of it, certainly, but it really is a recognition, an acknowledgement of the need a common, of a shared responsibility to defend our values and defend our nation against adversaries. And that means a public-private partnership. We need to rethink how we leverage human connections, how we leverage human relationships, and how we get at that challenge of meeting, spotting, assessing, developing, and developing relationships with the people out there who want to support our agenda and who believe in our values, and find a different way to connect with them that involves that includes a public-private partnership on that challenge, because there are many folks, many people who already live and exist in the private sector and public sectors who have access to people who want to share information, who have access to information and who believe in our values, and we need to find better ways at collecting information that way. Now, that is not the only answer, and I don't mean to suggest that the entire clandestine service needs to disappear. I think that there are a lot of points to pull out here, and to a lot of threads to pull on here, and in many ways we can take this discussion in the chat. But I have spoken for about, I don't know, almost half of my time right now. So rather than me continue to talk, I'll start to take some questions, and we'll see which way y'all want to take this conversation. So let's see.
Dwayne, can I remind you to also check the chat box as well as the Q&A box, because there'll be some other questions on that link as well.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Yeah, I will do that. Okay. Alfred says a criminal or spy will never drop off the grid. As we see in movies, bank robbers will live life as normal after they rob a bank. A spy can also hire someone to carry his phone or to create. How do you distinguish a true signature with a false signature? It's a great question, Alfred. Yeah, you can create false signatures, absolutely. But creating a false signature requires somebody to help you create a false signature. And the argument that I'm trying to make here is that even if you create a false signature, even if you're able to successfully have a signature that has you go into the movies with your wife or something, in today's world, you're going to have to pass through a number of other different sensors that are collecting data on you. Many third world countries, just as one example, right? So much of what you have to do if you're going to conduct a clandestine act, in most cases, what you have to do is you have to first determine that you are free and clear of traditional trailing surveillance, right? You don't have a surveillance team on you, so what you'll do. You'll sit there and you will have to determine your status first. So let's say that you've created two different signatures. You have a digital signature that's operating in your normal pattern of activity. Now you drop off. Now you have to avoid passing through other sensors. And how do you do that? How do you move about any urban environment today? If you're going to be in a car, it's going to have telematics on it. How do you get a car that isn't attached to you? If you're going to move out of your car, or you're going to not be caught by cameras, right, that are collecting information and are able to use increasingly sophisticated visual recognition software on you. But also, if you take public transportation, right, who pays cash for a cab in these days? In the vast majority of cases, you're going to use, increasingly in this world, you're going to use services that are provided. People don't pay cash hardly anymore. I hardly ever use cash. You use digital currency, whether it's your Apple Pay, or whether it's a credit card of some type. To conduct any type of transactional activity. And all of that is tied to an identity. So you not only have to lose your identity, you have to have another false identity, which again, if it's tied to things like facial recognition software, then you have potential conflict in identities. I don't want to get in, for the sake of this forum, I don't really want to get into the depth of that discussion. Instead, let me say, we can have a really robust debate today about whether or not this challenge is already upon us or solvable today. But let's assume for the sake of this argument that facial recognition will become an increasing part of our lives, simply whether it's for security or its convenience factor, that digital currency will become an increasing part of our lives, that whether it's through smart cities or other types of collections or social media, we will have a growing array of sensors. And as we enter this world of kind of sensors everywhere, smart refrigerators and smart sidewalks and smart advertising presented at us, we will see an increasing array of collections out there, and an increasing number of tools that are able to analyze those massive data sets and make decisions off of them. So while we can have a profound debate about whether or not this problem is here today, I think it is undeniable that we will eventually get to a stage, if you don't think we're already there today, that the idea that you can travel through society presenting yourself as something or someone you are not is not sustainable. So maybe we have, 10 or 15 years, maybe we have 20. I personally don't think so, but maybe we do. In any event, we still have to address this challenge, that the idea that we can still operate effectively under covers is a little bit like trying to build a more efficient internal combustion engine. If you're in the automotive industry and you're trying to build a more efficient internal combustion engine, is there a lifespan for that? Is there a lifespan? Sure, absolutely there is. But I think most people in that industry understand that we're headed to some other form of propulsion, and it may be a different type of combustion engine using a different type of fuel, but it's fundamentally different than what it is today. Okay, Umar, what are some of the first steps the IC can take or plans to take in order to create stronger public-private partnerships? So public-private partnerships are well known to the IC. There are some of them that are very public knowledge today. And you can read about things like, Project Azorian and some other. I mean, there are books written on public-private partnerships. If you go back to the early foundations, certainly of the U.S. intelligence community, when CIA, for example, was created, we didn't have the same structures and mechanisms and functions in place that we do today. We had a very different kind of view. But what you did is you went out and you looked for the people out there, whether they were foreigners or Americans, who could help you, and you had conversations with them, and you figured out how much you had to bring them into the loop in order to leverage that relationship. And I think that the private sector is very similar. There's a shared interest in protecting our value system. The Facebooks and Googles and Apples of the world would never have been created in some of our adversaries' countries. They simply would not have emerged from those type of environments. So the idea that these companies that have incredible reach and incredible capability, not just the companies, but the individuals within them and the new emerging startups, that they don't have a responsibility to defend the same values that enabled them to be created, I think is just a false premise. So the question is, how do you build a trusting relationship between those entities? And part of it requires government to be more proactive in sharing information on the threats and the background, right? Finding the mechanisms and forums to be more open to sharing the knowledge that we have. But also finding ways to incentivize those companies. But I believe that by sharing information with them, they will be more naturally inclined to cooperate. But I also think that rules have to be put into place, right? You shouldn't be able to necessarily operate in a free society if you are acting counter to some of the values of that free society. Okay, I'm gonna keep going because there are several questions here. So anyway, the first steps I think is sharing more and having more open conversations, recognizing that it's a shared responsibility. Boogie asks, how do we adapt and improvise our tradecraft in the midst of current proliferation of smart cities all around the world, like Singapore? Yeah, so the smart cities are going up everywhere, and it's not even just the smart cities, right? It really is just an incredible explosion of sensors. So we talked earlier, I think it was Jack who talked a little bit about, the idea of pilot projects. Like a lot of things, I think I think first you have to acknowledge that you need to fundamentally reinvent things. That Henry Ford used to say, if I'd have given them what they wanted, I'd have given them a faster horse. We spend an awful lot of time focusing on how we build a faster horse, when what we should be doing is thinking about what should we be building in the first place. And so I think the first thing that we need to do is think about is start from ground zero. And instead of saying, let's take all these processes and all these capabilities that we've developed over all these decades, instead, let's start fresh. What is our challenge and how do we answer it? And then I think the new tradecraft evolves from that. And I think you have to do it in prototypes. I think you have to do it in smaller test cases, and you have to be able to iterate with your answers, because you're going to make lots of mistakes. And we have to accept that, just like the private sector does. There's a different challenge here, right? When human lives are involved, or humans are involved, so I'm not suggesting that we take that lightly, but I am suggesting that we have to be able to and willing to make mistakes along the way and iterate and recognize that the new reality will be something entirely new. Tim asks if cyber hackers in the 21st century are they the 21st century clandestine operatives? So I'm biased, right? I spent almost 3 decades, basically my entire adult life, as a member of the clandestine service. I believe that there is still very much a need. The one thing that humans can tell you that, emails and phone calls can't is you can have a discussion, you can have questions, you can ask about plans, intentions, and then there's also the aspect of influencing those plans and intentions. There's a human in the loop in those discussions. So there's still a very human aspect to this challenge. So I think that today's intelligence collection needs to be more of a blended approach. I think that it requires teams that are configured differently than we've configured them in the past. There should be elements of all of the ints more effectively blended together, but there needs to be a human in the loop, or a human part of this that is considered. And I still believe that's a critical part of it. Okay, Holly asks, some argue that the US and presumably allies will need to more actively encourage defectors as a means to address current human challenges. What are your views on this approach? Well, I think it's a great question, Holly. I certainly think that there's no doubt that defectors have been huge contributors over the decades for us, and there's no doubt that they can be. I believe that absolutely we should welcome them, and we should have open doors, and we should have programs in place. I believe that we should more actively encourage defectors. I'm going to jump into the chat and say, Dan is asking, do you think we will see counter responses to the loss of privacy in the future, such as greater use of encryption or legal constraints on collecting and selling personal information? How might this affect the trends you've identified? I believe that in our society today, there's kind of a, I don't want to call it a shift, but there's a growing awareness of the need for privacy, and a growing acknowledgement that maybe the pendulum swung a little bit too far on openness, and that most of us have become a little bit too nonchalant about our privacy. The problem with that is that is very much a Western debate and Western discussion, my opinion. We have those questions in the United States, and we talk about, and in most of our allied countries, and we talk about putting measures in place that can help restrict and increase our levels of privacy. The problem is the sensors are still there, the data is still there, and our adversaries oftentimes have very sophisticated mechanisms of collecting it. And also, those privacy rules only apply when you're in our territorial borders, right? The second we go abroad, we walk into somebody else's environment, we are under their rules and regulations, and they do not play by our rules. So this idea, at least in my mind, the idea of privacy in this world today is simply not what we imagine it to be, right? you cannot assume that everybody coming to the table is going to play by the same rules, that they're going to, accept privacy as and follow those rules, or that they're going to have laws in place that are going to prevent them from collecting. So I think it's a little bit of a false premise to assume that increasing privacy laws make us safer or will make this more difficult for our adversaries. Certainly will make it more difficult for our intelligence community in some cases, right? If we are tying a hand behind our back in many of these efforts. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, we live in a different world. I mean, we have a different value set, and we should hold ourselves to a higher standard than our adversaries. But we need to do it, in my opinion, with our eyes wide open. We need to understand when we are hamstringing ourselves, and understand that our adversaries don't abide by those same rules. Tim talks about spearfishing ops. I mean, spearfishing is, I'm not sure I quite understand the context of the question, Tim, but I mean, spearfishing is out there everywhere, very effectively done by some very, very unsophisticated actors, and still have great success. So there's a ton of spearfishing. Can we use it? Sure. I think, again, we tend to hold ourselves to a higher standard across all lines, and that means that we tend to be much more open. And not all cases. I'm not going to speak universally about this, but in an ideal world, we're looking for people who want to work with us for the right reasons, not for the wrong reasons. And so you're really not trying in an ideal world to trick people into doing something they don't want to do. You want, especially if you're talking about getting at plans and intentions, if you're getting at plans and intention or influencing our adversaries, you really want to find and identify those people who share an interest, for whatever their motivation may be, but who have a common interest in helping us achieve our goals. So I as a threat to us, absolutely. As an operational tool in the future, my personal preference would probably be to use that in a very limited fashion. Okay, from Neil says, what's your assessment of Israeli disruption capabilities if they have been particularly audacious in their operations inside Iran over the last year in particular, with Israeli soldiers commenting indirectly that some of these operations have been carried out by non-Israelis, which points probably to classic cover techniques. Yeah, Neil, it's a great question. I think, so a ton of, there's been, so some of y'all may remember a very now highly publicized Israeli operation. And this is all open source. This has all been published in a number of different magazines in Dubai several years ago, where they took out, where they assassinated a terrorist adversary, and basically the entire Israeli team was wrapped up within the matter of, not wrapped up, they were never arrested, they had left the country, but they were identified by the Dubai police within a matter of a couple of years, simply by leveraging data sets. And although they arrived using very traditional, cover, they arrived on false passports from multiple different locations. They didn't stay in the same, what we would have considered very good tradecraft for a very long time. In today's world, because there were so many data points and data sets, the Dubai police were able to effectively uncover most of those operatives. So I think that what the Israelis, I think, are a little bit different than much of the world in that they are willing to. They don't necessarily care as much being caught after the fact. That the primary goal is to disrupt. And they believe that the cost of disruption, that the cost of not conducting that operation outweighs the potential cost of being discovered after the fact. So I don't know that I would look at that as an example. I mean, if they're, I still think the idea that, certainly we can do disruption operations. Most nations do them. The challenge is going to be, how do we sustain it, and how do you, continue to conduct them without not only, the Russian, again, well publicized, right? But the Russian kind of mentality is they don't really care if you know who they are. They just deny it, right? Just deny it. It doesn't matter, we know that Bellingcat, for example, was able to uncover the fact that the air surface to air missile over Ukraine that killed a bunch of civilians was launched by a Russian Buk missile launcher or Buk missile. It was, that's open source was able to piece all of that together. The Russians know that. They just deny it. They don't care ultimately if they're caught. They just deny it, and they just want to be in a position to deny this and appeal to the people who are going to believe their narrative despite the evidence to the contrary. I think it's, at least in my mind, any genuinely professional intelligence officer doesn't want to rely on just simply saying it wasn't me. You want to be able to generally conceal the activities that you want to be clandestine. Bruce says Mastercard has come up with the true name service so that transgender and non-binary individuals can put a first name of their choice more consistent with their identity on their credit cards. Maybe some of these commercial organizations would be able to provide some kind of sophisticated support to USG operators. A lot of ordinary people are concerned about privacy. If you had enough of these kinds of relations, wouldn't that help the digital desk problem? Yeah, so I think, I believe that there are lots of ways to build deeper and better covers. The answer that I would come back to, though, is the idea, the amount of energy and effort that needs to go into building and sustaining covers today, as opposed to as recent as 10 years ago. It is exponentially more complex today. And it requires an entire, if that's the method you're going to go down, if you're going to try to build cover and operate under using tradecraft, respecting these same foundations of the business that I talked about up front, then I think that you need to build teams to do this, and they need to focus the time and energy required to build and sustain those covers. And by teams, I don't mean everybody within that team is undercover. I mean that you need to build the resources to enable the person who is going to live and operate undercover effectively. And part of that is partnerships, certainly, absolutely, with companies or entities that are out there who are willing to help us. But a lot of it is really a reimagining of the way we do the business. Mel, is reinventing the business of intelligence easier for our authoritarian adversaries, China, where private? Yes. Yes. I don't know much else to say. Yeah, we operate under a different standard. It is far easier for our adversaries who don't abide by the same rules we do to kind of address some of these challenges head on. The simple answer is, though, I don't necessarily think that that's a disadvantage for us. I like to believe that the Western world has the moral high ground in this space, and that we have these. It is harder for us because we take the consequences of the alternatives much more seriously than many of our adversaries. So, yeah, it's easier for them, but that's okay. We never asked for it to be easy for us, and I think it's okay if it's hard for us. I have a couple more minutes. Boogie says, regarding human resources, to what extent should we encourage foreign students to support the IC's effort in diversifying workforce? Is there any role of current emerging technologies in it? Leveraging foreign students is a real tricky, that we have a lot of laws in place in the US for very good reason, right? That restrict us from using certain classes of people because there are consequences, right? If that is ever discovered, right? And then you taint, kind of certain relationships. I think it's a little bit of a tricky question. And there's going to be a challenge within our IC about how we address some of these challenges, right? You need a more diverse workforce. I think one of the answers is spending more time and energy and building better and stronger partnerships with the countries, with our allied countries. And I don't just mean the Five Eyes. I mean I spent much of my career overseas, and I worked with great partners all over the world who when you can find common purpose, will do great things in collaboration with the United States. And I think part of our diversity comes from being good partners to those partner nations around the world and finding ways where we can leverage their people, their officers, or their citizens who they have collaborative relationships with to service some of our requirements. But again, it requires us not just taking from those relationships, but giving and being a good, transparent partner with them. Okay, and then Holly says, one imagines that cyber ops could be of some use and that the adversary's ability to IDR operatives is only as good as the reliability of their AI-driven surveillance systems. In short, mess up their models and data sets, mess up their ability to IDR operatives. Yeah, absolutely true, Holly. But I think I would point out, I think you're actually making my point a little bit for me, right? The idea of a case officer, in my case, as I was, right, simply living a cover effectively without us taking cyber operations to support that, I think today just doesn't fundamentally work, right? It used to be that you could live your cover simply by telling a good story. There was very few opportunities for anybody who questioned you to go out and conduct the research required to figure out that you weren't who you said you were. If you had a business card and a phone number that rang at the right place, and you could present yourself effectively and speak the speak, then it was very hard for anybody to try to figure out that you weren't who you were claiming to be. Today, there are 100, maybe thousands of ways to go and vet and validate that. And so it's not just, do you have a LinkedIn profile, but it's, do you have digital dust that can be purchased that supports what your narrative is. And remember, intelligence officers too, oftentimes, if you're talking about training and deploying an intelligence officer, there are a few points where they can be easily identifiable, right? It's during the recruitment phase, when you're recruiting and hiring them, when you are training them, and then when they have to follow certain processes to disseminate the information they've collected, right? These are key kind of choke points where there are identifiable signatures, right? If you train everybody at certain facilities, or they're recruited through certain websites or mechanisms, or they have to submit certain paperwork, or if they go through certain processes. And again, we could analyze each point in this chain and make each point a little bit more secure and a little bit more resilient to adversaries. Again, I want to go back to the first point, which was, if we assume any level of development in these capabilities over the near term, then you have to assume that it will eventually become impossible to present yourself as something or someone other than who you are. That may be decades away, and I'm not suggesting that we don't have covers, but I am suggesting that the way that we use it today and the number of people that we have, operating in that fashion is probably already far outdated. Don and Julia, I see your questions just came in, and I will try to type an answer in for those, because I believe that I am out of time. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to speak here.
Great, thank you, Duyane. You can answer those questions in the panel session later on too, if you want to do that. Thank you for that very. Thank you for describing the very modern challenges that the espionage business faces today. It's really quite intense.